Hi, everyone. This is Kazuya, and I'm very much honored to introduce today's guest lecturer for our YouTube SLA lecture series, Professor Stuart Webb. Professor Webb teaches and supervises MA and PhD students at the University of Western Ontario in Canada. Professor Webb's expertise focuses on second language vocabulary acquisition, particularly incidental vocabulary learning through reading, listening, and watching television, as well as how words can be remembered and taught effectively. In my view, the field of vocabulary teaching and acquisition can be defined as pre- and post-Professor Webb era. His research topics are so practically important, but his approaches and presentations are academically so sophisticated, making the standard of vocabulary research on a different planet. So Professor Webb has published a number of papers in top-tier journals such as Studies in Second Language Acquisition, Language Learning, TESOL Quarterly, and Modern Language Journal. According to Google Scholar, his work has been cited about 7,000 times over the past 15 years. Amazing achievement. Not only is he very productive, but what I admire of him the most is that he has been helping run and publish a number of papers with his PhD students. His family is growing very fast, featuring several new star researchers in vocabulary research, such as Tatsuya Nakata, Mike Roger, Takumi Uchihara, Akifumi Yanagisawa. In terms of both research and teaching, Stuart Webb has been my idol and role model. One of his very well-known research areas concerns how to learn and enhance foreign language vocabulary knowledge through watching television. And as everyone must agree with me, this is a very timely topic as of 2021, when everybody stays home and must want to make the most of the time. He's going to give us a state-of-the-art review on this topic. And I think, Stuart, this may be your first YouTube talk, right?
Yeah, I guess it is.
Okay, so we're very lucky, very lucky and excited to have him as a guest lecturer. And I must urge both young students and scholars to watch this seminar and most importantly, interview afterwards. So please join me welcoming Professor Stuart Webb. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Kazuya. That was probably the nicest introduction I have ever had. And the fact that this is going to be on YouTube, I think I'm going to have to try to make all of my family members watch this just for the introduction. Not for the part that I'm going to do, but the part that you did. I'd also like to thank you for inviting me here. And this is my third talk for UCL. And it's always a privilege to talk to the students and the faculty members there, because UCL is a place that is really leading the way in terms of applied linguistics research and pedagogy. So it's exciting to be here. Now, I'm going to talk about second language learning through watching television. And I gave a talk at UCL about 3 years related to this. And in that talk, I focused primarily on research. Kazuya suggested that this time I focus more on pedagogy. So yeah, the talk today is more about practice, thinking about where we might go in the classroom. But I like to have a little bit for everyone. So we're going to start with a research focus. And I'm going to essentially start where I finished 3 years ago in my talk. And that is here. So the idea about researching second language learning through television, and for me, why I think it is an exciting topic for research. So it is a topic that is gaining steam and gaining momentum. There have been quite a few studies out in the last year. There were 2 special issues, one in SSLA and one in the Language Learning Journal related to audiovisual learning. But if we compare the topic of language learning through television to language learning through other modes of input, such as reading, there's really a very small amount of research in this area. You know, if we contrast it with reading, you know, we know there are thousands of studies focused on language learning through reading. We have important journals that focus exclusively on the topic. Reading Research Quarterly, more of an L1 journal. Reading in a foreign language, more of an L2 journal. The Reading Matrix, another journal entirely focused on the topic. Most applied linguistic journals, a lot of the research focuses on written input. You know, so if we compare that with language learning through television, there's really a tiny, tiny amount of research in this area. So I think it is quite an exciting topic that could be examined. And I think the nice thing for beginning researchers or established researchers is if we think about language learning through watching television, the justification is likely to be very high for looking at a different type of input. And a really nice thing here is that we can use studies of reading or written text as models for our new research looking at this type of input. So for example, we can look at studies related to reading or written text, and we can look at the research questions and then apply them, move them from reading or written text to audiovisual learning. We can start with the literature you provided in those earlier studies with reading, and then build on that and apply it to audiovisual learning. If there was really strong justification for these research questions with reading, there's likely to be that strong justification for looking at it with second language television. And we can begin by developing our research design and base it on, build it on that earlier research design for reading. So there's a lot of possibility here that we can begin with. And one of the things I said 3 years ago is, if you were interested in this topic, I would go and I would look at, studies of reading and written text that have been very influential, highly cited. And, I might look at, what are the 10 most influential studies related to reading and written text, and find those and then see, could I apply these research questions to language learning from television? So I've been looking at vocabulary learning with television primarily, but language learning with any mode of input can look at many, many, many different things. It doesn't have to be vocabulary learning at all. It doesn't have to be SLA at all. We can look at a lot of different features of television. For me, I think it's a very exciting area for research, but I also think it's a really exciting area for pedagogy. And I'll get to that in a minute. But essentially what I'm trying to begin with here is saying, for master's students, PhD students, if you're looking for a topic, television, might be a great place to start, in terms of looking at topics. I think language learning from television is challenging, but I think any good research topic is challenging. One of the things that students sometimes say when I suggest topics to them is, that sounds like a difficult topic. And that always makes me laugh a little bit, because there's no easy topics. And any piece of good research, should be challenging, right? So what I think is exciting about research, in a way, research is like a puzzle, and it's trying to, put that puzzle together, and overcoming those challenges is part of the fun. And I think, research can and should be fun. Okay, now to the practical side. So that's the research side, and I think afterwards when I talk with Kezia, we'll talk a fair bit about research. But I think it's important to think about the practical side of this topic, and I think that there's a lot that can be done, a lot that can be improved in terms of second language learning. I know I taught English as a foreign language for many years in Japan and in China before that. And when I go back and think about my teaching, I always tried to do the best that I could, but I realized I could have done better. And certainly in relation to television, if I used it, I could have done a much better job. So when I think about television, I'm thinking about television in a slightly different way than has typically been applied to second language learning. And I'm usually talking about extensive viewing. And the idea here of extensive viewing is watching second language television regularly as a means to increase second language input and improve second language proficiency. So it's about watching large amounts of television. It's not about watching a short segment of television or a bit of news or something like that, or random pieces of television. The idea here is about language learning through watching television regularly in the classroom in a principled manner. So I think this likely contrasts how television is typically used in the classroom. And the idea of extensive viewing builds on Day and Banford's principles developed for extensive reading. Okay, so we'll talk about those principles now. So I think first and most importantly, the language learning benefits must be clear to everyone. Using television regularly in the classroom, I think, is quite a scary thing for teachers, because if their colleagues, if their students, if the students' parents don't understand the value of watching television in the classroom, teachers who do this are likely going to be criticized and be on the defensive right from the start. So it's really important that the learning benefits of learning with second language television are clear to everyone, particularly whoever has hired you, whoever you are working for, but also for the students and the parents of the students, if we're talking about at junior high school or high school. To some degree, I think a little bit different from extensive reading, pre and post viewing activities might be needed to help students and other teachers see the English language learning focus. But these activities shouldn't be on the onerous, demotivating types of activities, because the whole idea of language learning through television in the classroom is to show students that they can enjoy watching television and lead them to watching second language television outside of the classroom. So, what are the benefits of language learning through watching second language television? This is why research is really important here. And a growing number of studies is helping, I think, to support the use of television in pedagogy. But we need more. The more research that gets out there, the easier it will be to justify this approach. So, benefits to language learning through watching second language television. We know that second language learners are motivated to learn through watching television. There's a growing amount of research that clearly demonstrates this, and that their motivation is higher for learning with television than it is for other types of input. So that's a big positive. And it also, I think begs the question, well, if students are really motivated to learn from this type of input, well, why isn't it commonplace in the classroom, right? Shouldn't we be using the types of input that students are most likely to engage with? Second benefit, increasing the amount of second language spoken input that students engage with. And I think typically students are engaging with written input, especially in the English as a foreign language context, contexts like Japan or Korea or Brazil or Spain, for example. A third benefit is learning new words. So again, more and more studies showing that we can learn words through encountering them repeatedly in television programs, movies, other forms of audio-visual input. And, this can involve learning new words, learning sequences of words, helping further develop our knowledge of partially known words, increasing our recognition of the spoken forms of words. So, for example, when students encounter the written forms of words in the classroom, that's going to help them with developing knowledge of the spoken form to some degree. But it's not going to help them to recognize spoken forms when they're fluently used to a large degree. I think Kezia could provide a lot more input on that statement than I can. But the idea here is when second language learners are encountering the spoken forms of words in the classroom, they're usually encountering teacher speech, people talking fairly slowly, fairly clearly in the manner that I am trying to do now, rather than if I'm talking with Kezia, if I'm talking with family and friends, where I'm talking much more quickly, there's multiple people talking at the same time. This is much more challenging. So encountering the spoken form of words in fluent discourse, that's a big positive. Also, we know that watching television is likely to help us to improve our listening comprehension, okay, which is really important. There's a tiny bit of research suggesting that watching second language television might help with improving our pronunciation, which is exciting, as well as improving our grammatical knowledge. So there are a few things there, but again, if we compared this to reading, where we have thousands of research findings, here we're really talking about, in the tens of studies, and not a lot more than 20 studies probably. Okay, the second principle with language learning with television is that students should be at the appropriate level. This is really important because the whole idea here is we want to encourage, further viewing outside of the classroom. So if watching television is too difficult, that's going to be discouraging. So we don't want to start too early. There is some research now that suggests that, we might start with, watching second language television with first language subtitles, then move to second language captions, and then eventually, watch without captions. And I think that is an area that certainly deserves a lot more investigation and is exciting. But yeah, I think for me, with relatively little research, we want to be careful. We want to encourage further learning. So we want to make sure our students are at a level where they can get something out of it. They can understand enough to enjoy it relatively quickly. So in an earlier study with Michael Rogers, we recommended that students who know the most frequent 3,000 word families would be able to adequately understand watching television, watching movies, and I think this works for, you know, most audiovisual materials. However, the research that has been conducted so far suggests that students can cope and learn when they know fewer words than this. So maybe they've just mastered the most frequent 2,000 words. They may still be able to get something out of this, and maybe even less than that. So that's quite positive, but again, we need a lot more research in this area. Now, in terms of figuring out, well, are my students at the appropriate level? I think in terms of resources for vocabulary knowledge, the vocabulary levels test is the most widely used and most valuable test, I think, for pedagogy. It was originally developed by Paul Nation in 1983 and then updated by Schmidt, and Clapham in 2001. The most recent version is one that I did with Yosuke Sasao and Oliver Bollins that came out in 2017. And I think that improved on the earlier versions to a large degree as well. This newest version has measures of students' knowledge at the 1,000 word level, at the 2,000 word level, 3,000, 4,000, and 5,000 word levels. And students don't have to take all of the levels. They could just take the 1,000 level if they were at the beginner level. This is a really useful thing for teachers because it helps to see, you know, where vocabulary learning should occur. So if students haven't scored highly at the 1,000 level, then teachers should focus on further developing students' knowledge of that level because the value of words relates to their relative frequency. And the most frequent 1,000 words account for about 60 to 80% of the English language. The most frequent 1,001 to 2,000 words, about 3 to 10%. So a huge difference. And by the time we get to the 5,000 word level, you know, we're down to less than 1%. The test is freely available in written form and electronic form on my website. So if you Googled Stuart Webb, Western University, you would find that. The scores provide a good indication of whether or not television might be appropriate for learning. And so what teachers should look at in terms of using this test is, you know, have students mastered the 1,000 level, the 2,000 level, the 3,000 level, you know, to what degree have they mastered those levels? At the end of the test, there is feedback provided. The electronic version of the test essentially looks like this. You get a definition together with 6 words, and you have to click on the word that goes together with that definition. Teachers, a nice thing with this electronic version is that teachers could give them an email address that they make up just for getting their students' responses for the test. So it could be, you know, my vocabulary levels test results at gmail.com. They give that to, you know, they create that email address, give that to their students and tell them to put it in at the end of the test. And the scores for all of the level together with the feedback that the students will see at the end of the test also gets sent to the teacher. Okay, the third principle. Listening comprehension should be supported. So the value of language learning with students, with television and students in the classroom is that teachers can support comprehension. And this is really, really important because watching television initially for those who have not done that, second language television, is likely to be very, very challenging. I think I was told by teachers when I studied French in Canada that you know, I should go out and watch French language televisions, which are freely available on Canadian television. And I think I, you know, grudgingly went and tried to do that a couple of times. And after 2 minutes, gave up. It was, you know, it was too fast, too difficult to clearly understand and enjoy. So I would just, you know, go back to watching what I would usually watch. And I think second language television is often discussed in this way in pedagogy. You know, teachers know the value of it, And they will say to students, go out and watch second language television on your own. It's useful, but, probably only 5% of students, the most motivated 5% of students might go out and do that. So by just encouraging students to do it outside of the classroom and not really following it up, not supporting comprehension, teachers are essentially saying, this is a useful thing, but it's not useful enough for me to look at in the classroom, which is really the wrong message I think that we should be providing to students. If we're going to say that something is useful for language learning, well, we need to focus on it in the classroom, because students are clever and they're going to focus on whatever it is that we focus on within our classroom to a large degree. So what can teachers do? Well, before viewing, we can pre-teach character names, we can pre-teach places, we can pre-teach storyline, we can brainstorm a little bit about the topic to help students to prepare for what they might encounter. We could pre-teach vocabulary as well. Michael Rogers and I, we did a study in 2011 about what we called narrow viewing, which again builds on narrow reading. The idea of narrow viewing or narrow reading is viewing or reading multiple texts about the same topic. So when it's about reading, you read, for example, a sequence of articles about the American election or the pandemic, for example. And by reading related articles, gradually the newer articles become easier. With narrow viewing, what we were trying to say is, you should start with one television program, start with season 1, episode 1, and then season 1, episode 2, season 1, episode 3, season 1, episode 4. And in doing so, each subsequent episode will be easier to understand because we develop our knowledge of the storyline, of the characters, of their relationships. And while it may initially be quite difficult, gradually it becomes easier and easier. And if we look at the words that occur in the television programs, this is supported. Other ways that we can support second language comprehension of television programs, we can provide our students with glossaries. So we can create glossaries based on the vocabulary, the difficult vocabulary that's likely to occur in that program, give those to students, develop those for our language learning centers. We can pre-teach vocabulary so that the difficult vocabulary that does repeatedly occur in the program can be understood by students. We can watch an episode more than once, or we can have students watch the episode more than once. And for adult language learners, this is something that they might not be willing to do. But for younger language learners, it's not uncommon. And it is something that second language learners have told me that they do. And if you think about children, for example, watching the same movie or television episode again and again and again, or even your own viewing. If there was something that you saw, a movie that you saw and you really enjoyed, you might have seen it many times. So that's a nice thing related to television, audio, visual input. So ideally, where we want to go with providing support is we want to have our own self-access centers that students can go to within our institution, and we want to provide the learning support there for the students. So for example, we could grade different television programs according to their difficulty. Some, are going to be more difficult to understand than others. And when we develop glossaries of key vocabulary, we can provide those with the shows. And gradually, as we do this with more and more shows, there's more and more support that can be provided. We can provide background information. So I think a long-term goal is, as this second language television and extensive viewing becomes more a part of the classroom-based second language learning experience, we can gradually build resources. And ideally, across institutions, we could do this as well. The fourth principle, I think, is a particularly important one, and that is that precise comprehension should be a goal rather than a requirement. As a teacher, I know that, as a teacher, you feel you need to do something when you're in the language learning classroom. You need to teach. Sitting with your students and watching a television program with them doesn't feel like teaching. You feel like you need to be doing more. And sometimes that can be, okay, asking comprehension questions, and then being a little bit frustrated that our students don't know the answers to those comprehension questions. But we have to understand that we should not expect students who aren't familiar with watching second language television to understand everything. Initially, they're going to understand very little. Our goal of watching in the classroom is that their comprehension increases with our support and with using television in a principled way. Our primary goal for our students viewing should be enjoyment and interest. Okay, and this is the same for extensive reading, which I think is one reason why extensive reading in the classroom, while there's a lot of research support for it, is also a very difficult thing for teachers to do, because teachers feel like they need to teach, and watching their students read or watching television doesn't feel like teaching, and it doesn't feel like, for students, maybe what the teacher should do. And again, that's why research is really important here. So teachers and learners should not expect precise comprehension. We should also prepare our students for that. We shouldn't have them feel disappointed if they don't understand things perfectly or don't understand a joke. That's okay. The goal is that comprehension is enough to enjoy the experience, at least at the end of our program. We hope that comprehension will improve in degrees, from general understanding to gradually more precise over time. But it may never be perfectly precise. And we should remember that as television viewers, we don't understand everything perfectly in television programs. My wife is a second language learner of English, and sometimes when we're watching television, she will pause something and ask me what something means. And she'll be quite frustrated, actually, when I have no idea. And it's like, don't worry about it. It's fine. You don't need to understand everything. And as a first language learner, I often don't understand everything. That may just be my innate inability to understand things. And similarly, while our focus should be on pleasure and interest, we don't want to have onerous post-viewing activities. In the same way we don't want to do this with extensive reading. We don't want to have students watch a television program with a goal of motivating them to do this outside of the classroom, and then at the end say, okay, now you have to write a report about this television program, because that takes all of the fun out of the experience. We can have activities, language learning activities related to the viewing, but we don't want them to be the really demotivating activities that are sometimes done. The fifth principle is that classroom-based extensive viewing should guide out-of-class viewing. And this is that idea where we shouldn't just say to students, watch TV outside of the classroom, because 95% of students are not going to do that. It's going to be too difficult, I believe. I don't think that's really supported necessarily by research. So our goal should be to help students get to the point where they feel confident enough that they can enjoy watching second language television. And if we get them to that point, they might actually do it. So the greatest benefit of extensive viewing in the classroom is not what they learn in the classroom. Often students learn a relatively small amount of language over a period of classroom time. That doesn't mean that that teaching experience isn't important. It's foundational knowledge. But if they're going to become someone like Kazuya Saito, who is, highly fluent in a second language, he had to learn a lot of that outside of the classroom. Probably the vast majority of his language learning probably occurred outside of the classroom. And so what we're trying to do here is to get our students to watch television outside of the classroom. And if they do that regularly, then they can make huge language learning gains. So the goal here is that students will eventually watch as much second language television as possible. So it's important that we provide sufficient classroom time to do this. We shouldn't make it homework. Okay, so we shouldn't expect students who are unfamiliar with watching second language TV to start watching it regularly without support if they have never done that. I think a lot of students, if they really have to, a reasonable number of students will probably try to find ways to say they've watched the television without actually watching it. Students shockingly can be kind of strategic. Again, maybe let's just say this is the approach that I might have taken when I was younger in terms of getting out of something difficult that I didn't enjoy. So getting students to realize that they can improve and enjoy viewing second language TV in the classroom is really the goal here to help to motivate further second language viewing. Okay. So those are the principles, the key principles. What are the challenges to doing this in the classroom? I think the biggest one and most important one is getting everyone involved to buy in. And that's the students, your colleagues. You don't want to be known as the teacher in your institution who has their students watch television. If nobody understands why the students are doing this, it's probably not going to enhance your reputation. You want your colleagues, your bosses, program directors, parents to all understand the value of this. So to get past the idea that if students are engaging with second language input inside the classroom extensively, that teachers are not teaching. Teachers can still do a lot here. Teachers are doing a lot here. The idea is to support comprehension. We can still do intensive activities with television as well, before and after. But I believe it's the extensive approach, getting students comfortable with encountering large amounts of input, which may lead to encountering much larger amounts of input outside of the classroom, that is probably the key to having a much greater proportion of second language learners reach an advanced language learning status. Other challenges with using second language television in the classroom are that it can't be easily manipulated. Written text is much easier to manipulate. We can make it simpler. We can modify it. It may not be appropriate for lower level learners. As I said, we want to encourage further viewing rather than discouraging. So if students are at too low a level, they're not going to get much out of it. And it might discourage learning. Not all programs are appropriate for classroom viewing. I loved the TV program Game of Thrones, but I would not use that in the language learning classroom as much as I enjoyed it and as much as some students might enjoy it. It just might be tricky. And I think the other challenge is the perception that television is only a source of entertainment. It's funny, we read for enjoyment and interest. We watch television for enjoyment and interest, but one mode of input is thought to be educational while the other is thought to be entertainment. And we need to get past that. And again, that's where research comes in. Okay, now I've been talking about extensive viewing. And I think sometimes when we talk about different things in language learning, people start to argue that it's a dichotomy. It's this or that, and one is good and one is bad. And I think that's really problematic in applied linguistics. And I've been trying to talk about that in a couple of things that I've written lately. one being in a chapter I wrote in the Routledge Handbook of Vocabulary Studies, which came out last year. That we shouldn't argue for one thing in contrast to another. Instead, we should try to be more inclusive and understand that, you know, many things have a lot of value, and different things have different degrees of value to different people. So I'm not trying to argue here that we shouldn't do extensive reading. Extensive reading has a great deal of value. I think extensive viewing can also have a great deal of value, and we can use them together, okay? So extensive reading contributes to learning the written form of the language. Extensive viewing is likely to also additionally focus on the spoken form of the language. Okay, so they can supplement each other. Some students might really gain a lot from extensive reading and not like extensive viewing. Some students might gain a lot from extensive viewing and not gain a lot from extensive reading. We want to try to cater to as many learners as possible. We should also think about other resources for learning, you know, language learning through encountering large amounts of input. YouTube videos are nice. They are much shorter. Students are, younger language learners are spending a lot of time with short segments of audiovisual materials. Songs, of course, very popular in culture. A study that I did with Pavia Webb and Fayez that came out in 2019 in SSLA showed that we can learn vocabulary through listening to songs, podcasts, open lectures. There's a lot of different materials that can be used for second language learning. Okay, so I think, you know, those are the types of things that I think are important in terms of pedagogy. So I think there's a lot more that really needs to be said. So I hope that people watching this can come back and consider this. You know, what do you think are the challenges of implementing an extensive viewing program in classrooms, and how can we overcome those challenges? I think research is particularly important here, but it's more than that. You know, this is a presentation is always a simplification of a fairly complex issue. But hopefully there have been some useful things within this talk that might stimulate more use of television in a new way within the classroom, as well as hopefully more interest in researching second language learning with television. That is all. Thank you very much for listening. Listening for, in a talk, I would usually try to break things up with questions. So listening for this period of time to me talk about one thing, I think is a little tiring. So I apologize for that. But if you made it this far, thanks very much.
So Stuart, thank you so much for such a practical and accessible and up-to-date research and presentation. Yeah, thank you so much. I really like that. You know, the presentation always features classic sort of references, but also super up-to-date, you know, references, obviously including yours and your students' work. And yeah, I truly enjoyed. And as I said earlier, this must be very timely to so many people all over the world. And it's also timely in a sense that this is now being delivered on YouTube. So by now, yeah, so people now must understand what it means by learning, you know, second language from watching something in a second language. So yeah, this is really.
That said, when I suggested YouTube at the end there, I don't recommend for teachers to take their language learners and say, watch a video like this. That could also be discouraging to watching further YouTube videos. I think there's a lot of value to this series that you're doing, but yeah.
I see. So okay, still students' enjoyment comes as a priority.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stuart. Okay, obviously I have some questions to follow up, if I may.
Of course.
Thank you. So actually, you know, my friends and you know, like teacher friends and also researcher friends and everybody is talking about the actually watching second language television, especially with an aid of captions. So this is quite interesting. As you pointed out, there isn't much. I mean, research is definitely growing a lot, thanks to your work and contribution. But at the very same time, people on the street have very different opinions and experience in terms of how to actually use the captions to help ourselves understand better second language television. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, and that's something that I probably should have included that point, because one of the most researched areas in audiovisual input is on the benefits of captions and subtitles, and so there's a lot of work going on in that area. The person who comes to mind first to me is Maribel Montero Perez, and I believe that she has a state-of-the-art article coming out in Language Teaching on learning with audio-visual input, which should be a useful resource for those interested in the topic. I don't know when, it won't be out for a year, I expect, but I do believe that is coming. But yeah, the research does show that captions can aid comprehension and can aid vocabulary learning. There is, and when I say captions, I'm always talking about English language captions. Yeah. So, whereas subtitles, I'm talking about first language subtitles. I sort of differentiate between them with those labels. The research tends to show that captions tend to help when the input is more difficult.
Oh, I see.
So they do aid comprehension, and it may relate to the degree to which the episode of television is difficult. So that is one way that teachers can provide support. And the nice thing about captions is it's linking the written form with the spoken form.
Right.
A lot of foreign language learners, have greater knowledge of the written form. So when they hear the word in a television program and can see the form of that word on the screen, that helps them to link that knowledge. So that's a very useful thing.
I see. That's quite useful. Okay. And then you also mentioned a little bit about the repetition. Like, do you have any comments on this? So some sort of combination of repetition and the caption? Because sometimes people say, "Oh, you should watch with caption first, and then you should rewatch or something like that." But again, people have very different thoughts and opinions because they're not really research based. But from your point of view, what do you think?
Well, that is a very researcher-like question, I have to say.
Really? But it's a kind of a common practice, like, common question, like, should we watch again? Because I have kind of understood, but,
Okay, because within your question, I think what you were sort of talking about is if we were to control for different factors within our, to what degree does frequency contribute to learning, and to what degree does captions contribute to learning? As researchers, it can be interesting and useful to ask such questions. But I think we always have to remember that our goal is to help language learning. I think the degree to which captions help and the degree to which frequency helps, as long as they help, that's the key thing.
I see.
Whether one helps slightly more than the other, I think is less important, but it is something that researchers will really focus on as applications. It's like,
oh, I see.
You're not teasing this apart well enough. I think it's a legitimate comment, but we have to remember who we are doing the research for. And sometimes gets lost in that nuanced look at research.
That's true. Yeah.
So I would say they both help.
I see. Yeah. Maybe it's good for students to know that there are some good strategies: caption and repetition, probably.
Well, repetition clearly helps, and captions clearly helps. I don't know if there's been any research that distinguishes the degree to which the two help. But yeah,
I see.
But I don't, that probably would be a publication, but it's not one that I necessarily think is the best topic.
I see. Okay, yeah. I'm always a good student, so I always ask a very good question as a researcher. So thank you. Yeah. Okay. I see. It may not be a best topic, but it could be a topic of some kind of publication.
Yeah.
Interesting. Oh, and Stuart, this is also coming from my colleagues actually in Japan. That it's good to watch the second language television, but it's interesting that a lot of students in my country, Japan, they know a lot of vocabulary in second language English, but they can't hear them. They can't hear them. Yeah. So it was quite useful that you introduced the way how teachers and everyone can check vocabulary size through your website. But that format was on written. So do you have any comment on that? Because I think this could be something. I mean, because in my seminar at UCL, we talked about it, and a lot of questions came out again about how to actually measure students, listening or watching vocabulary size. Yeah,
and I think we do know that if we use spoken cues, written cues, that the results will likely differ. And Jim Milton did a study related to this that came out in CMLR a while back, showing scores are different when we have spoken cues and written cues. And there is a version of the vocabulary levels test that has spoken cues. It's not one that I did. Okay, Stuart. So this is my final quick question. And are you subscribing to Netflix or Amazon Prime? I am subscribing to both of them, as well as another one that we have here, as well as two other ones here. Oh, I'm so ready to hear, and this is very convincing. I see. So you are fully understanding and enjoying the potential of. And actually, what was quite interesting lately is that we've been watching French programs on Netflix. So Lupin came out recently, the French language. So we watched that with captions. Right. That we were watching Call My Agent, which I think the French name was or Dix Pourcent. Dix Pourcent, I think it was, yeah. And again, and then watching these things, actually it helps with my remembering French, which I studied long ago. Professor Stuart Webb is subscribing Netflix and watching the French television movies, and he's improving his French. This is the most convincing statement I've ever heard. So then I'm wondering, Stuart, because YouTube too, but Netflix, Amazon Prime, there's so many online platforms where students or anyone can enjoy watching second language TV movies. Do you have any recommendations for actually those who are designing the platforms? Amazon Prime or Netflix, because sometimes I feel a little bit frustrated about certain functions in Netflix. So if you have any thoughts, they may be watching this one. So it's interesting actually, because my sister is a television executive, and we've talked about approaching Netflix with ideas. So I do have lots of thoughts. Oh, really? Okay. Yeah. But I think there could be a lot of improvement, and I think that there's a big market for that. But resources are being developed in relation to Netflix and language learning, and but I think there's a lot that could be done. Thank you. This could be maybe another talk. Okay. All right. Yes, sure. That's it for now. So let's move on to interview session. Which will be really, really exciting, which something that I have been really looking forward to. Okay.